On November 29th, 1966, at 2:15 in the morning, the 600-foot freighter Daniel J. Morrell tore in half on Lake Huron in a storm that shouldn't have killed anyone. 4 men made it to a life raft. 3 days later, rescue helicopters found the raft grounded near Harbor Beach, Michigan. 3 bodies lay frozen to the deck. The 4th man was still breathing. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The thing about Lake Huron in late November is that it gives you warnings. The sky turns a particular shade of gray. The wind picks up in gusts that make experienced sailors check their weather reports twice. The temperature drops fast enough that you can feel it through steel. These are not subtle signs. These are the Great Lakes telling you to find shelter. On the night of November 28th, every other ship on that stretch of water had already done exactly that. Every ship except 2. The Morrell was making her 34th trip of the season. She was heading north in ballast, empty except for the weight needed to keep her stable in rough water, bound for Minnesota to pick up iron ore. It was supposed to be the last run before winter shut everything down. The crew of 29 men had been working the lakes all season. They knew the ships, knew the routes, knew November. Some of them had families waiting at home. Christmas was less than a month away. This was just one more crossing before they could call it a year. The Morrell had been built in 1906. 60 years on the water. She'd been the longest ship on the Great Lakes when she launched, called the Queen of the Lakes. She'd hauled coal, iron, or limestone taconite. She'd been refitted over the years with new boilers, a new engine, radar, updated safety equipment. She'd survived 6 decades of November storms. There was no particular reason to think this one would be different. At 2 in the morning, a watchman named Dennis Hale was asleep in his cabin when he heard a bang loud enough to wake him to the storm noise. He thought maybe the anchor was loose, bouncing against the hull. He rolled over. Then he heard it again, louder this time. Books fell off his shelf onto the floor. His reading light went out. That's when the alarm started. He grabbed his life jacket and ran into the passageway, wearing nothing but his boxer shorts. There were no lights in the forward section of the ship, but he could see lights still burning in the stern. He went back to his cabin, feeling his way in the dark, and found his pea coat. That was all he had time for. When he came back out, he could hear the sound of metal tearing, not the groan of a ship working through heavy seas. The sound of steel being ripped apart. The main deck was heaving. In the darkness, he could see sparks where electrical cables were snapping. Steam billowed from severed pipes. The deck itself was bending in the middle, twisting in a way that steel isn't supposed to move. The noise was worse than the alarm. A slow, grinding shriek that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The ship was tearing itself in half. 8 minutes. That's how long it took from the time the alarm sounded until the Morrell broke completely in 2. Not an explosion, not a sudden catastrophic failure. 8 minutes of the ship coming apart while the crew tried to get to the life rafts. Most of them never made it. When the hull finally split, the bow and stern separated, and the men who were still on deck were thrown into 34-degree water in the middle of a storm with 60-mile-per-hour winds and waves that topped 25 feet. Hale hit the water and thought he was dead. That was his first clear thought. In water that cold, in a storm like that, with no survival suit and almost no clothes, there was no reason to think otherwise. But he surfaced, and through the waves he saw a carbide lamp glowing from a life raft that had gone over the side when the ship broke. The light kept disappearing behind walls of water, then reappearing. He swam toward it. 2 other men had already reached the raft. They pulled him aboard. A 4th man arrived moments later. 4 men on a raft built to hold 15, in the middle of Lake Huron in a November gale, with no way to call for help because the ship's electrical cables had been severed when she broke apart. The men fired flares. They had emergency signal flares in the storage locker on the raft, and they used them in the first few hours because there were other ships in the area. Someone might see. Someone might come. The flare gun broke after a few shots. The handle separated from the barrel, but they held the pieces together and kept firing until all the flares were gone. Then there was nothing to do but wait in the darkness and try to stay warm. The raft had no canopy, no protection from the wind or the spray. The waves that crashed over them were 44 degrees, which felt almost warm compared to the 33-degree air. The men huddled together at one end of the raft. Two of them, young deckhands in their first year on the lakes, died around 6 in the morning. No dramatic moment. They simply stopped responding. One of them had white foam on his lips. The third man, a wheels man named Fuzzy, lasted until late afternoon. He talked about his wife. He worried what she would do without him. Just before 4 in the afternoon, he lifted himself up with one hand on the deck of the raft and one hand on Hale's hip and said it wouldn't be long until they bottomed out on the beach. Then he collapsed and didn't move again. Hale spent the next 24 hours alone with 3 dead men. The raft had drifted to within 200 yards of shore, but grounded on a sandbar. There were oars, but he was too weak to use them. His fingers had no feeling. His feet were numb. Ice formed on the bodies of the men around him. He tried to suffocate himself at one point, putting his hands over his mouth and nose, but all he managed to do was gag. He held his urine to conserve body heat. When he needed water, he dropped the lanyard from the broken flare gun into the lake and sucked the water off the cord. 38 hours after the Morrell broke apart, a Coast Guard helicopter spotted the raft. The searcher later said that when Hale waved, the movement was so faint he thought it might have been caused by the rotor wash. They lifted him off the raft. He weighed 160 pounds when the ship went down. He weighed 118 when they pulled him out. He'd lost parts of his toes to frostbite. His core body temperature was so low the doctors weren't sure how he was still alive. Here's what didn't make sense. The Morrell had been traveling with her sister ship, the Edward Y. Townsend. Same design, same age, same company. The two ships had been moving north together through the storm. But in the early hours of November 29th, the Townsend's captain made the decision to take shelter in the St. Clair River. The Morrell kept going, alone, heading for Thunder Bay. No one ever explained why the two ships separated. No one ever explained why the Morrell's captain chose to keep pushing through a storm that was already bad enough to send every other vessel to shelter. The Coast Guard didn't even know the ship was missing until 12:15 the next afternoon, when the company reported it hadn't arrived at its destination. By then, Hale and his 3 companions had already been on the raft for more than 30 hours. The first search helicopters went up that afternoon. They found the raft around 4. If they'd known 12 hours earlier, if the Morrell had been able to send a distress signal when she broke apart, the 3 men who died on that raft might have lived. The official investigation concluded that the Morrell sank because of brittle fracture in the hull. The ship had been built with low-carbon steel, which becomes brittle in extreme cold. Under the stress of the storm, the hull simply cracked. The report cited this as a common problem in ships built before 1948. It was presented as an explanation that made sense. Old ship, old metal, cold water, bad storm. Case closed. But that explanation never quite fit. The Townsend, identical to Morrell in almost every way, had been in the same storm. She'd survived. When they finally got her to dry dock, they found a crack in her hull, but she hadn't broken in half. And there were other ships on the Great Lakes, dozens of them, built with the same kind of steel in the same era. They'd all been through November storms. They hadn't snapped in two. Years later, researchers who examined the wreck found something the initial investigation had missed. The clock on the stern section of the Morrell had stopped at 3:28 in the morning. The ship broke in half at 2:15. That meant the stern had continued moving under its own power for more than an hour after break, driven forward by engines that were still running because no one was left alive to shut them down. The stern had traveled 5 miles before it finally sank. In that time, it had circled back and slammed into the bow section, where the men were trying to board the life raft. The impact from the stern was what threw everyone into the water. If the engines had died when the ship broke apart, the men would have had time to get onto the raft while it was still attached to the bow. They would have had supplies, maybe even had time to put on warmer clothes. The survival rate would have been different. No one could say for certain why the captain had chosen to keep going when the Townsend turned back. Both ships had the same weather information. Both captains had the same experience. The decision to separate in the middle of a storm like that wasn't standard procedure. It wasn't reckless, exactly, but it wasn't cautious either. And the Morrell had no backup communication system. When the electrical cables snapped, the ship lost everything at once. Radio, distress signals, lights. There were other vessels within range. If the Morrell had been able to send even a single mayday, the response time would have been measured in hours instead of days. The families of the lost crew were told it was the steel. Old ships, cold water, one of those things that happens on the Great Lakes in November. But when divers finally explored the wreck in the late 1970s, what they found raised more questions than it answered. The sections of the hull showed signs of metal fatigue that had been developing for years. There were stress fractures that should have been visible during inspections. The Morrell had been certified as seaworthy less than 2 months before she sank. Someone had signed off on her condition. Someone had looked at that hull and declared it safe. In the hospital, Hale asked the nurses every day if there were other survivors. He couldn't believe he was the only one. 29 men had been on that ship, for had made it to the raft. Why was he the only one still breathing? The nurse finally told him to stop asking. If anyone else was out there, they were dead. He felt ashamed, embarrassed. He didn't want to be the sole survivor. He wanted his old life back. But the 28 men who'd been his crewmates, the men he'd worked alongside for months, the men who'd been his family on the water, they were gone. For almost 20 years, he didn't talk about what happened. Survivor's guilt is what they call it now. Post-traumatic stress. The weight of being the one who lived when everyone else died. He avoided going out in public because people would recognize him, would want to know about the wreck. He trained as a tool and die maker, tried to build a normal life. The company that owned the Morrell paid a small settlement. There was no workers' compensation, no long-term support. He was on his own with memories that wouldn't leave him alone. What haunted him most wasn't the cold or the fear, or even watching his crewmates die. It was the questions that no one seemed interested in answering. Why had the ship been allowed to sail in that condition? Why had the captain kept going when the Townsend turned back? Why had there been no backup communication system? Why had it taken so long for anyone to realize the ship was missing? Each of those decisions, each of those failures, had contributed to what happened on that raft, and no one was held accountable for any of it. In the early 1980s, Hale finally started talking. He spoke at the premiere of a documentary about the wreck. It was difficult, but he felt better afterward. That led to more appearances, more interviews. He wrote a book about the experience. He became, in a way, a spokesperson not just for the Morrell, but for all the men who died on Great Lakes freighters in storms that maybe could have been survived if different decisions had been made. He kept the memory of his crew alive because he felt like that was his purpose, the reason he'd lived when they hadn't. The Edmund Fitzgerald sank 9 years after Morrell in another November storm on Lake Superior. Same number of crew, 29 men. Same outcome, total loss of life. But the Fitzgerald became famous. There's a song about it that everyone knows. The Morrell faded from public memory. Not because the loss was any less significant. Not because the questions were any less important. It just didn't have the same cultural moment. It became one of those tragedies that people in the shipping industry remember, but that never quite penetrated the larger public consciousness. What we know for certain is this. The Daniel J. Morrell broke in half on Lake Huron at 2:15 on the morning of November 29, 1966. 4 men survived the initial disaster and made it to a life raft. 3 of them died of exposure before rescuers arrived. 1 man lived. The official cause was brittle fracture due to cold water and old steel. 28 men died. What we don't know is harder to quantify. We don't know why the ship's captain made the decisions he did that night. We don't know what conversations happened between the Morrell and the Townsend before they separated. We don't know why inspection records that should have caught the metal fatigue didn't prevent the ship from sailing. We don't know if the 3 men who died on the raft could have been saved if the search had started sooner. We don't know if any of this was preventable. There are people who believe the official explanation tells the whole story. Old ship, bad storm, tragic accident. There are others who look at the timeline, the decisions, the missing distress call, the delayed search, and see a series of failures that added up to 28 deaths that might not have happened if any single thing had gone differently. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Not a conspiracy, not malice, but the accumulated weight of small decisions and overlooked details that created conditions where a survivable accident became a fatal one. Hale died in 2015 at 75 from cancer. He spent the last decades of his life trying to keep the memory of the Morrell and her crew alive. He visited schools, spoke at maritime conferences, worked with researchers trying to understand exactly what had happened that night. He wanted people to remember not just that a ship sank, but that 28 men died who had families and lives and futures that ended in cold water on a November morning. The wreck of the Morrell still sits on the bottom of Lake Huron, 2 sections 5 miles apart. The bow and stern rest upright in about 200 feet of water. Divers visit the site. The ship has become a piece of Great Lakes history, a reminder of the dangers that commercial sailors face even on inland waters. But for the families of the men who died, for the daughter of the crewman who'd been taken off the ship with pneumonia just days before it sank and spent the rest of his life dealing with his own survivor's guilt, for Hale's widow who watched him struggle with the trauma for decades, it's not history, it's personal. The question that remains isn't whether the Morrell should have been on the water that night. Ships sail in bad weather. That's the nature of commercial shipping. The question is whether the systems that were supposed to keep those ships and their crews safe actually worked, whether the inspections were thorough enough, whether the communication equipment was adequate, whether the decision to separate from the Townsend was sound, whether the delayed search response cost lives. No one was ever charged with negligence. No one was ever held responsible for the deaths beyond the official finding of structural failure. The shipping company paid settlements. The Coast Guard updated some procedures. The maritime industry learned from the disaster, implemented changes meant to prevent similar accidents. But for the 28 families who lost someone that night, those institutional responses don't answer the human questions. Why was my father on a ship with a failing hull? Why did no one hear the distress call that never got sent? Why did my husband die in sight ashore? Hale spent 38 hours on a raft watching men freeze to death. He survived temperatures that should have killed him. He lived another 49 years, carrying the weight of being the one who made it. He never got comfortable with that role. Even after decades of speaking publicly about the disaster, even after writing his book and working with researchers and becoming something of a Great Lakes legend, he still wrestled with the fundamental unfairness of his survival. Why him? Why not one of the other 3 men on the raft? Why not more of them? The questions never really go away. They just become part of the story you carry. Cases like this don't disappear. They just fade when people stop asking questions. The Morrell sank 58 years ago. Most of the people who remember it happening are gone now. But the wreck is still there, and the questions are still there. And somewhere in the gap between what the official reports say and what actually happened on that ship, there's a truth that never quite got told. Not because anyone deliberately hid it. Because investigations look for clear causes and simple explanations. And sometimes disasters are messier than that. Sometimes they're the result of a dozen small failures that add up to something catastrophic, and no single person or decision is solely to blame. But the outcome is still 28 men dead and 1 man left to carry their memory. If you've ever wondered why ships still sink in the age of modern weather forecasting and satellite communication, why experienced sailors still die in storms they saw coming, the Morrell is part of the answer. Because the systems we trust to keep people safe are only as good as the people operating them. Because economic pressure and schedule demands and 60 years of successful voyages can make a hull inspection seem routine instead of critical. Because someone has to make the call whether to keep going or turn back, and sometimes they get it wrong. Because even when everything is working the way it's supposed to, Lake Huron in November is still cold enough to kill you in minutes, and being right doesn't matter much when you're in the water. What happened to the Daniel J. Morrell that night? The ship broke in half and sank. Why? That's the question that doesn't have a simple answer. Not if you're being honest about it.